Hello, I am Amy Keller, and this is my reflective response for the personal vocational exercise in orientation to the New Testament. The scripture I chose is Ruth, chapter 3, 10 through 11. "The Lord bless you, my daughter," he replied. "This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character." I chose Ruth because I knew she was a person of God and even in Jesus' lineage. Some of the words from this passage that appeal to me are, "The Lord bless you," "kindness," "don't be afraid," and "woman of noble character." This passage fits the idea of personally identifying with Ruth, or so I thought. More on that soon. Ruth saw trials, heartache, and hardship. Yet as seen in the passage, she is still strong, kind, and has noble character. I lead painting classes that I call Christ in Canvas. After picking my passage and working through this exercise's first steps, I knew I would paint something and turn it into a lesson for a class. I tell those in my classes that it is worship art, and the steps through it are more important than the actual finished project. I like to have purpose throughout the process. My first step was to paint the background. I will explain the reasoning behind this step later in my response. The next step, I painted the words famine and death because this is how the book of Ruth starts. Next, Ruth and her mother-in-law Naomi weep many tears as seen in Ruth 1, 9 and 14. As I alluded to, this is where my exercise took a surprising turn. Even through all of her tears and hardship, Ruth is still strong, kind, and has noble character. It would be simpler to be Mara, or bitter as Naomi wanted to be called. Like Ruth, I have not always had an easy life either. As I discovered in step 4 of this exercise, I tend to lean towards Naomi's bitterness. Even though Naomi has redeemable qualities, like her discipleship of Ruth, she was bitter enough to want to change her name. After thinking I would identify with Ruth at the beginning of the exercise, I actually am more like Naomi. While my circumstances are different than Ruth and Naomi's, I still need to remain kind, unafraid, and of noble character. I need to show kindness even when I want to grumble instead. I need to not be afraid of the next bad thing to happen and trust in God's provision. My next step, and it was a big one, was to paint grain to show that God provided for Ruth and Naomi. God covers over death and our tears for us. I can rest in knowing He will provide for me as well. I painted this wheat to remind myself and show my future Christ in Canvas class of God's provision. I was driving by this field last week and saw this beautiful wheat turning gold. I also saw the sun setting in the distance. You can tell by the flatness of the field that I do not live in Knoxville, but in Indiana. The picture doesn't do justice to how big the sun looked and how red it was. The sun was blood red because of the fires in Canada, making our air quality terrible. However, it made a beautiful picture showing that God was even redeeming this terrible natural disaster by showing His beauty through it all. It wasn't until I stopped along this country road to take a picture that I realized this is what I wanted to paint for this exercise, adapted to fit my Christ in Canvas class. Through this picture, He showed His provision again to me by giving me this inspiration. This picture is why I painted the background, the colors that I did. Through all of life's circumstances, good and bad, I need to keep a reputation of having noble character by serving others like Ruth served Naomi. I need to teach and disciple like Naomi did to Ruth. We need to stay kind and unafraid. The pretty colors in the sky are there to remind my students and me of those reflective thoughts. The next step was to add the book and verses I chose. Seeing Ruth's name as a person of God in the painting will remind me and my future students that her name is also written in Matthew as part of Jesus' lineage. God can take any circumstance and redeem it. Boaz was Ruth's kinsman redeemer that asked for the Lord's blessing on Ruth. This seems to point to Jesus. Jesus is my kinsman redeemer. The last step was to paint the blood-red sun to remind us of God's Son and His blood sacrificed for us. My students and I will look at our completed paintings and be reminded that by believing in Him, we already have God's blessing through our own kinsman redeemer in Jesus Christ. We can remember to use Ruth and Naomi as models of being people of God.